to sort of do the quick summary from that, I mean, we know that learners create knowledge actively and uniquely inside their own head. So we know that students are creating knowledge inside their brains at all times. We are as well. And we know that students learn best when they experience course content in multiple modalities. So we know that you can't just say something, you need to support it with some visuals, you need to have some experiences that go along with it. The more modalities we add to a particular learning experience, the more likely you are to learn it. Now, I want to be very, very careful. This has nothing to do with preference, okay? The idea of learning styles, which keeps coming up, we need to do this because students' learning styles are different and everybody learns this way or that way, and that's not true at all, okay? There is absolutely no evidence for learning styles. They do not exist at all. There's no evidence for them in the literature. And even if there were evidence, anything that they've looked at, there's the idea of saying, you're an auditory learner, so I have to teach you this way to make you learn better. No evidence whatsoever. The reason, though, that we want those multiple modalities is not because people like to learn because somebody's talking to them, but that we want to have as many opportunities as possible to learn something. And sometimes you might hear something, but not really understand something until you see the visuals attached. And then actually when you experience it, it cements it even farther. So the more modalities, the better. Second, we need to know that learners learn best when they connect new knowledge to existing knowledge. We, as a faculty members, have to help students up the staircase. That's basically what we do. We build on things that have come in the past. We make connections to previous courses. We make connections to their life. We want to make sure that all of those things are connected together so that it's a progress forward. The third, we know that in order to learn, you have to focus attention on the learning experience. This goes to the wonderful other myth, which is the myth of the multitasker. Now, how many people well, if you have kids, I have 3 kids, how many people have you had kids or have students that said, oh, no, I can do all these things at the same time because I'm a really good multitasker? Doesn't exist. No such thing as multitasking. Our brains do not multitask. We are not multitasking humans. We cannot do that. And one way to really look at this is if you Google online any of these wonderful videos about people texting and writing and then falling into fountains as they walk, you can know that we cannot do multiple things at the same time. We can switch tasks very quickly, so we can do 2 things. It seems like we're doing 2 things at once. But what we're doing is we're attuning our attention to one thing or another. We can only attend to one thing at a time. Which means if the student is in your class surfing Facebook, writing email, etc., while you're doing an activity, they are not engaged. Okay? And if the entire class is doing something else while you're teaching, it might give you an indication that engagement is a bit of an issue, and you need to figure out why are they doing that, as well as what kind of activities you're getting them to do. Fourth, motivation is the precursor for everything. We need to make sure students are motivated to learn. Motivation can come in lots of different ways. It can be, you're going to get graded on this. And can also be, ideally, the more internal, the better, the concept that we want students to be able to strive to learn this information because they need to know this information. But one of the things about motivation is we have to give students the opportunity to be motivated. We have to show them the connections. This is why this is important. You know this crazy, stupid fact I'm talking about right now? There's a reason why this is important. Or, guess what? I had a patient the other day, and this is why this is exactly relevant. Well, there's a reason why students love those stories, is because it allows them to make those connections. Feedback. One of the few things we really do know in education, the closer the feedback is to the event of the learning, the more likely you are to learn. Which is why if you're going to do any sort of intervention with a student and a patient, it's best to do it right after they met with the patient than, let's say, 3 days later. Oh, by the way, the person you saw on Tuesday, you kind of did a whole bunch of things wrong, right? That doesn't work. We know it doesn't work as well. And one of the things that is a result of this feedback is a great example of why students cry in your office after the first midterm. So why are they crying in your office after the first midterm? Because they've never had feedback until the midterm. And then they get that feedback and go, oh my goodness, everything I'm doing is wrong. I studied the wrong things. I really had no idea, and now I'm in trouble. So we need to give them opportunities to get that feedback early and often, as much as possible. And last, of course, they need to work on engaging, collaborative, authentic experiences. There's nothing worse in learning about medicine than spending your time reading something from a book as opposed to actually hearing from what's happening with the patient. And there's a reason why a lot of the ideas around problem-based learning focus on patients and cases as opposed to just learning the facts first. And so I think that's another sort of piece that we have to keep thinking about engaging, collaborative, authentic experiences. So we know all of this stuff about learning. But I think one thing that's come up as a word that's frequent and sort of, I guess you'd call it the buzzword that's currently rippling through universities is active learning. And I guess one of the things that we need to do in order to unpack that is think what active learning is. So here's a great definition of active learning that I think is really interesting to think about. Now, active learning can involve jumping jacks and running around the room, but that's not exactly the idea around active that we're talking about here. What we're talking about is ensuring that the mind is actively engaged. Okay? Now, if the mind is actively engaged, that means students can do active learning in lots of different ways. Active learning does not require speaking. It does not require students talking to each other. You can be actively engaged with content. You could do, actually, note-taking is a great example of an active learning process. You're reading something, you're picking out important ideas, you're, let's say, drawing a concept map from the notes that you have, or summarizing activities. Those are active learning strategies. So I think we have to be careful not to conflate active learning with talking all the time. That's not what we necessarily mean with active learning. And the second part, though, here is that students are dynamic participants in their learning, the second part of the three. Active learning requires students to make decisions and be engaged. They bear a responsibility in this process. You cannot do active learning if the students don't want to do it, right? Which is what we sort of run into problems of, where if, let's say, we want to do a task and then nobody at the table wants to engage, you've got an issue. So I think this is an important piece, is that we have to actually talk with our students and help them understand that, teaching is not done to you. You're not just a passive recipient in this where you sit there and just absorb everything and you don't have to work. There's a lot of work involved in learning, and you have to engage in that process. And so we have to make students aware that this is not a type of class, this is not a type of activity where you're going to sit there and do nothing and study it all later. We're going to learn now. And in order to learn now, we have to work at it. The third part here is the reflecting on and monitoring the process and the results of the learning. So it's not just enough to do the work, but you have to stop for a minute and think about, what have I done? And why am I doing it? And why is it relevant? So that reflection process that has to occur. So all of these things we need to think about when we're designing active learning opportunities for students. But usually what comes up right after that is, well, wait a minute. I went to medical school and I learned a particular way, and I'm fine. So why do I have to change anything? Because, we did lectures, all we had was lectures, and then we had patients, and then we learned on the wards, and everything was okay. Why do we possibly have to worry about this? And I think there's two answers to this. One is because there's evidence that it's much more effective to do a different way. But the second thing we have to remember is, a lot of the time, as faculty members, most of our students are not us. They're not going to be us. Faculty members are generally the exception, not the rule, of the graduating group. Most of the students that are, say, in medical school that you're dealing with are going to go on to become doctors and may never teach at a university, may never decide to have a research portfolio, etc. And that's an important distinction, that the faculty members, we often think that we are replicating ourselves in our students, and we're not. We have to be careful of that. But there is an enormous amount of evidence, and I think I want to just point to 4 particular articles that I think are useful to think about active learning as a strategy and why active learning can be so successful. The first one is a study from Richard Hackey from Indiana back in the late 80s that talked about looking at physics and looking at 2 different methodologies in terms of success in physics. Now, one of the nice things that physics has something called a force concept inventory. And it's a really, really cool assessment that basically measures the amount of physics knowledge you have without necessarily talking about physics or having you do equations. So what they're able to do with the force concept inventory is basically assess a group of students before, let's say, a course, and then assess them after a course. And they can look at these conceptual changes. A lot of them are around, okay, if I spin a ball on a string around my head and I let go, which direction is it going to go? Or if I drop a feather and a bowling ball at the same height and I let go, are they moving at the same speed or not? These are sort of concepts in physics about gravity, about acceleration, things that if you know a little bit about physics, you might be able to answer. And so what they found very clearly is that students in courses with interactive engagement had a gain of 2 standard deviations higher than the traditional methodology of lecturing. Straight up. 2 deviations higher, across the board. And this is with thousands of students that they were looking at. The N is 6,500 students they were looking at. Okay, that's one small example. Here's the example that we have here. Is the active learning had the biggest gains, and this is sort of the details about the average class scores and looking at the different groups of college and high school, whether they were doing things actively or not actively. The normalized gain being 100%. There's an example there. Another example here is if you're looking for a really great overview research article on active learning is does active learning work, a review by Michael Prince. He's actually an engineer, and this is published in an engineering Department of Chemical Engineering, and this is actually in an engineering journal. And what he did was he looked at all the different types of active learning out there, so problem-based learning and collaborative learning and all the wonderful buzzword names, and basically looked at there is across the board evidence in almost every situation that active learning was better in terms of promoting the outcomes than traditional kind of approaches, i.e. just a lecture, okay? An important thing to keep in mind. So again, another example there with a huge amount of studies that he looked at. A third one, and one of my favorites, is by Joel Michael, who did something, he's actually a physiologist, and looked at where the evidence for active learning was. And basically came again to the same sort of conclusion, looking at all the studies that they were examining about the enormous wealth of research supporting the benefits of active learning. And one of the really fun things that he talked about in this article is said, you know, if this was in medicine, and we were talking about drug effectiveness, we would have stopped researching this about 15 years ago. We way surpassed the evidence that exists that it can actually get better outcomes. But we just keep doing it over and redoing it over and redoing it over. And the last one, which I want to point to, which is an enormous sort of meta study that looks at STEM courses in 2014, that talks about active learning across science, engineering, and math as examples, looked at what is particularly interesting is that students in traditional lecture courses were 1.5 times more likely to fail compared to students in courses with heavy active learning components. And that the active learning classes outperformed those in the identical exams at least a standard deviation higher. So this is looking at, again, at thousands and thousands of students. And what seems to be interesting is when you start really looking deeply at this evidence when it comes to active learning and lecturing, it's not the top end students that are really receiving the best benefit. So the students that are at the high end of the curve tend to be at the high end of the curve despite the teaching we do to them. In other words, they're really great. They're at the top end, and if we lecture at them or do active learning, they do well just about anything. They're almost impervious to teaching, which is kind of interesting. Whereas what's interesting when you look at a lot of the active learning studies that look at the strategies, it's actually the bottom part, the bottom half that is moved significantly up. Failure rates are significantly lower, especially minority students. So there's lots of evidence that it's actually helping at the bottom pulling up than it is necessary at the top pulling up. So that's something to keep in mind, and there's a lot of evidence around that we can keep looking at. If we want some more, let's throw a bit more at it. We have improved student understanding, improved student retention in general student population to underrepresented minorities, as I said, attitudes, problem-solving skills. We have perceptions and attitudes towards information literacy. We have increased enthusiasm, increased content knowledge, graduate capabilities, and critical thinking. There is an enormous amount of evidence here, okay? And if we wish to ignore it, we can't say it's because you have to prove it to me.